Good evening and welcome everyone. So pleased to see the cinema so full again. My name is Max Azolla and I'm the Art Basel film curator. I will briefly introduce the screening today and then hand over the microphone to Omer Fast and Sergio Fant. I will do this with my little 8-month-old son, because if I put him down now, he'll start to cry. And we don't want that. This is the second year of the collaboration between Locarno Film Festival and Art Basel. Last year, Locarno showed Duncan Campbell here. The cinema was packed. We showed a short film program on The Voice in Locarno in August. The cinema was full. We had a great Q&A, and I think we took that as a good omen. So we wanted to continue our collaboration, not just because it's a creative exchange, but also because we really got on and started a really interesting dialogue. So I'm very pleased to inaugurate the second edition, let's say, of our joint project. And I will welcome first Sergio Fant on stage, who will tell you a little bit about the film. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxa. Thank you very much. And thanks also to Michael Müller, the two persons that are very close to us in organizing and getting to this collaboration. I mean, it's a pleasure. The second year that I have the pleasure to represent the Locarno Film Festival here in Art Basel. As you know, the festival is coming up soon. As usual, we take place in the first 2 weeks of August. So as you can imagine, while I'm here this evening, my colleagues are still buried under hundreds of screeners and films to watch. I have a pleasure to take a day off and to be here in Basel today. It's very nice. It's not just because I'm taking a day off, but it's also nice because, I mean, selecting films for a film festival, very often it's a very bleak experience. You are dealing with hundreds of people having no clue about what film is and what film can be. So it's really a pleasure this evening to introduce the work of an artist and to also to have a conversation with him afterwards, who on the contrary is extremely conscious, is extremely able and skilled in exploring exactly all the possibilities and the layers and the chance that one has just moving images and what one can say and do with film. So I mean, it's really a pleasure to take a break from watching hundreds of films that are not doing that at all, and to introduce you this evening Omer Fast, which I hope is coming down because I didn't see anything at all with the lights. Welcome, Omer. Thank you very much. And we will have a conversation with Omer after seeing Continuity. This is going to be the first screening in Switzerland of the film, and also one of the first following the premiere at the last Berlinale. Again, I think it's a film that comes at a very crucial moment in Omer's career. But this year he had 2 feature films almost coming up at the same time. So I think it's a very interesting moment, also thinking from our point of view as a film festival, looking at the director that comes from an experience with installation, with multiple screens, and then coming and starting possibly a new path, but we will talk about that hopefully later. So I leave the microphone to Omer for a short introduction.
Hi, thanks for coming. I was just going to say when you started to talk that this is definitely not going to be a film that says, what film is or what film should be. What it could be, what it shouldn't be, maybe. Anyway, thank you for coming. Enjoy the film. We'll be back. We're going to tank up a little bit, right? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a nice evening. Preparing for this evening, I was going through some materials about this film and about other works of Omer, and I printed out and had a look at the press book that was done on the occasion of the premiere at Berlinale last February of the premiere of Continuity, the film you just saw. And as usual, this press book are very often have the synopsis of the film, of course, but since journalists, they always look for the shortest, the better to cut and paste. They have different versions of the synopsis in the press book of every film. And this in itself is something kind of very Omer Fastian, different versions of different lengths of the same story. But then I realized in the press book of Continuity there is something even more tricky. That brings me back not just to this film, but to your work in general. That the
I never read it.
Okay, now you're going to find out. The log line, which is basically the one line that is supposed to summarize the film, carries one information that the short synopsis and the long synopsis, they don't. Usually it's the opposite. The more these texts, they expand one to the next, the more they carry more words and more information, but basically preserving the information that was given in the previous shorter version. In your case, it's different. Because the log line, it's the only version of the synopsis that mention the cannibalism. So in the log line, we are talking about, the press book speaks about two middle-aged cannibals. And cannibalism disappears completely from the short synopsis and the long synopsis when it's much less clear what these people, who they are and what they're doing and what they're eating also. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I actually did choose the word cannibals to describe them. And I think this has to do with the fact that they're consumers. And what they consume, of course, they have this kind of ritualistic consumption that they produce in their house and that they partake in. And we see, of course, at the very beginning, food being cooked, so you know what they're eating. But there's always this kind of shift between the spätzle and the Sauerbraten that they're making, and the kind of the young men that they invite into their house. And so this was just it's a log line, so it's one sentence to get sort of attention. And I thought it would be as dishonest, or even more so dishonest, if we were to describe them as parents or as hobbyists or as something else. So I thought cannibals would be maybe a nice...
But on purpose, you removed it from the longer synopsis?
No, I think the log line was written at the very end.
Okay.
And so we wrote the whole business beforehand, and then somebody said, "Can you write a log line for this?" And I just wrote down
the word came back.
Middle-aged cannibals because
it's. I was looking some other of your films ahead of this evening, and there is another one in which cannibalism is brought up. That is everything that rises must converge when the adult film producer and director as well is talking about his parents, describing his parents as radical cannibals. And then there are I read other things that where you're talking about wounds and arms and legs, and as we see also in the end, being cut, being torn piece. There was something like this that goes through your work, and that you were interested in going back with continuing.
Of course, it's cannibalism is being used in a sense metaphorically. On the one hand, we're talking about consumption, and a kind of a consumption that's become hyper in a way, and so they're not just consuming the food that they produce, and they don't only produce a kind of a ritual that is consumed, but they also increasingly produce this offspring that they consume with each meal. But I think it's also about taboo, and I think that for me at least, this notion of cannibalism is this kind of border, sort of a liminal sort of zone where consumption becomes aberrant. And of course, very much what we're engaged in with visual media, when we think about advertising and we think about what, half of the stuff that we're looking at is always encouraging us to consume something. So I always try in my work to pursue that logic to its aberrant ends. And so what we have here are two, for me at least, a portrait of Uber consumers, two middle-aged couple who's obviously well off. They have a nice car, they have a nice house, they have all the sort of comforts that they need in order to live, and what they do is much more ritualized and much more primal. They produce a kind of a ritual between them in order to sustain a relationship in which young bodies are consumed, and these bodies are the young men that they bring home. And of course, the film is not graphic in that sense, and of course, it's not as explicit as it's not a horror splatter kind of film. They don't invite these guys, chop them up and eat them, but they consume them nevertheless.
In several, if not all, of your previous work, they were often starting from an encounter with a witness of something that you were starting to talk to, and that was the the starting point of several of your previous works. And very often this encounter as a recording or as a filmed interview was also becoming part of the material you were starting to edit and to work on. In this case, there was something, I mean, we're not seeing this encounter in the film, it's not part at all of the piece, but there was something before this story that, from which this story kind of took off and started.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be too long probably to go into the whole sort of the prehistory of this. I mean, the work was originally commissioned by Documenta 13 in 2012, and I had a completely different idea, which was based on a documentary, based on talking to women who were imprisoned in what used to be a Franciscan monastery outside of Kassel. And I started that process, and I became extremely disillusioned and sort of disheartened by what it is that I was doing with these women, and I couldn't sort of turn that sort of ethical corner with them, and I felt extremely sort of lost in that process and disconnected from it. And at the same time, Carolyn Christoph Bakarjiev, who's the director of Documenta at the time, was saying, Omer, I don't want you to make a performance, because I wanted to use these women's stories and get zombies, sort of get people to dress up as zombies and move around Kassel, the Documenta grounds. And whenever they would encounter visitors, and visitors would kind of corner them, they would begin to spew out these women's stories, and these women's stories were heartbreaking. And Carolyn, because she put her foot down on my zombie project, and I also was disheartened, I was forced to come up with a new project about 4 months or so before the exhibition opened, and this turned out to be that project. But for me, the sort of the documentary trigger for it was a statement made by a German defense minister at the time, Mr. Struck, who talked about the German engagement in Afghanistan and said that what they're doing there is not war. And I understood his statement politically. I understand as a politician that he needs to make, especially for a German audience, the notion of conflict, armed conflict, a German military engagement in a foreign land, palatable to a home audience. And I began to take that statement and to chase it up to its, again, aberrant sort of ramifications. If it's not war, what is it? If the soldiers are not soldiers, what are they? If the parents who send the soldiers to that place are not parents, what are they? If they're not sons, what are they? If it's not food, what is it? If it's not a camel, what is it? Everything that you see in this is, in a sense, appears in the beginning naturalized, which is the way the story begins. And then, of course, it begins to tip into the denaturalized kind of world where these sort of inversions take place. And so that is the documentary trigger, if you will, for that story. It's not an interview. It's not a real story. There are no parents in Germany who do this, of course. Every German parents are, I'm a German parent. We take care of our kids.
I mean, we started this conversation because usually it's easier to start it with some questions from here, and so the audience can have some time to think about their own questions. But if you have some, please raise your hands and join us. You somehow started to answer my next question. This is the first work of yours that you shot and you made in Germany, am I right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering how much this changed your approach or the subject, and in some way you answered me already, because one question was you often dealt with war, but maybe not with war, with army, with being in the army, or with stories from the military, and you did that mostly before with the Israeli military, with American soldiers or pilots and so on. And this was the first time you're showing instead German military. And I was wondering if one of the elements was exactly this different point of view of how to tell about war. But there were other things that made this work different for you by shooting it in Germany, in terms of the things you were looking at, the way you were looking at things, the inside of the house, the road they are traveling, the train station. I mean, things that you were interested in that made this film very different in some ways from the previous ones.
Part of the financing in 2012 came from a German TV broadcaster called Dreisat, and so and that came very early on because Documenta provided those funds, and they selected 3 artist projects to be shown on TV. And this was, to me, a wonderful opportunity to think about what TV represents for me. And I always thought about TV being the kind of the organ, the medium that is best representing in some respects, middle class sort of bürgerliche, bourgeois sort of values. And I always thought about wanting to make a kind of a family melodrama. And so this is what this started as, and a German family melodrama. And so it started as being literally a kind of a Kammerspiel, a sort of a theatrical sort of piece where we watch one family, obviously in Germany, enacting a particular scene that we would say, oh, well, this is kind of a tough situation. The son has been away, and he comes back, and there's some issues, and they're going to work through them. And then obviously there's this kind of rupture in the narrative, and all of a sudden the scene is sort of reloaded and it begins to replay. And at that point, your whole notion of your whole anchoring in what is natural, what is German in a way, is destabilized, and you're beginning to, you have to come up with your own sort of idea for what this is. And again, I talked before about this process of inversion. What kind of a family is it? Is it a family? And so what is distinctly German about this? I don't think of the story in a sense as inherently German. It's more the production that was extremely German. It's horrifying to speak to German actors in German when you haven't been doing it for a while. It took me, I'm speaking English now, and you can get a sense of how long I take to answer a question. It takes me 3 times as long in German, and so it's talking and talking and talking until they say, "Well, lass das Mensch, wir machen das," and then they begin to act. So it's more the production side that's inherently German, but of course, there's this notion of trauma and this notion of conflict and violence that is at the very periphery. And I was interested in this notion of what the German engagement in a foreign conflict would be like, but not sort of going out there to Afghanistan at the time in order to talk about it, but rather, instead of looking at what's out there, looking at what's in here. And when the stories sort of come back, what kind of context are they finding, and what is the ground in which they're going to sprout? And so, if anything, the piece is, in a sense, a portrait of that. Stories coming back, the baggage coming back, the trauma coming back, and trying to find a language to address that in a very sort of uncanny, sort of stylized, impossible sort of situation.
And if originally you were thinking of this, of showing the piece on TV, and there was this financing thing, when it was a matter of making this piece we saw this evening, so expanding it and shooting something more and thinking about a very different destination, so no more TV, but possibly the movie theater or maybe an installation. I mean, we're going to talk about that because this project existed also in different forms, no? I mean, so how did you move from the original project to making and adding something in order to make this new film?
It's like a relationship that's not over.
The project was supposed to be like that back then, and you didn't have the time or the
No.
Okay.
No, I made the piece originally for Documenta as a 40-minute piece, and I was happy with it for about a year. And then I started to rethink and sort of question some issues there. And it really is like a relationship, and somebody broke the relationship with you, and the person leaves, and you're left with all this shit on the floor, and you're looking at pictures all the time, and you're thinking about the stories and whatnot, and it's not over for you. And you're constantly replaying scenarios in your head and going, well, I wish I would have said that, and I wish I could have changed that.
This didn't happen with other projects of yours?
Oh, all the time.
All the time?
Yes.
But this is the only one you actually reworked?
We have at least... Well, we have some gallery people here who know me for a few years, and they can talk about how I tend to edit the work, re-edit it just before the opening and sometimes afterwards. It's a living thing, and then you die, and then the work is unchanged. But as long as I'm alive, it changes.
But in this case in particular, it was also, not just the stories were keeping like working in the back of your mind, but I think you also had to change the style. I mean, you moved from shooting mostly inside to shooting more outside, and also including some. I mean, expanding also the time. I mean, going to flashback or possibly some flash forward. So I mean, the writing of this, how did it?
Well, when I don't know what to do, which was the case here, I tend to double things. I tend to split them into double them. And this, for me, it yields, in a sense, a situation where there's a point and a counterpoint. There's opposites. There's a situation of having a dialogue. And there's also the uncanny that enters it. Because just like the dinner scene, you have this dinner once. When you have it the second time, you're all of a sudden extremely... you're thinking about whole different other agenda than what you were the first time around. And so my notion was to revisit who this son is, this kind of archetype, this Daniel figure. And what I tried to do is to create at least two different sort of iterations or two different versions of the son. One is a kind of a past son, and one is a sort of a future son or a projection of the son. There's also a version of the son who belongs to the mother and a version who belongs to the father. And if you notice, if you look at the movie carefully, you see that every time that the kind of the long-haired blonde soldier type appears, the father is always in his vicinity. He's always, it's something either that he sees or he fantasizes. And for me, he's a kind of a figure that the father invents in order to punish. Because he always gets abused and punished. And so, in a way, there's not like a kind of a key or sort of a magic answer that will sort of neatly wrap this film up into a logical, linear explanation, but there is this kind of, let's call it a psychological landscape in which these two parents exist. They have a contract between them that involves a ritual, and each one of them has this sort of fantasy life, and the movie sort of dips in between all these elements.
You I don't see hands, so we go. Please.
I just remembered seeing the film in Documenta, the version with the son belonging to the mother. Only this part, it was kind of déjà vu, and I was wondering what I'm watching really. So it was very nice to see it continued.
Yeah, it's just woven. The 40-minute version exists, and in between that is this whole new material that was shot in 2015.
Are you working like this also in other works? Like to do...
I try not to, because it's not good for my health, and it's not good for the health of others. But yeah, I mean, it's good. You know, it's a process. So I get to revisit relationships long after they're over. That's a kind of a luxury that I'm unable to do in my personal life.
But in the case of this project, you didn't just rework the structure of the narrative, you reworked also the format of presentation, because, it was an installation in Documenta, then you did a version, I think it was called Diptych. It was also another one, and then I think there is something else on 5 screens that you did afterwards. Can you just tell us, how also you're reworking on that aspect, not just on the structure of the piece itself?
Well, that's going to be really tough, but Spring is all the new material, and that's a work that exists almost as a diptych, as a sort of a compendium, but actually works, I think, independently of the original continuity, and it exists on 5 screens, and it's kind of silly to talk about it without seeing it. But what it does is it explores that psychological space that I tried to talk about before very spatially, because it's not just one image divided across 5 screens. Occasionally you have a shot and counter shot appearing simultaneously, or you have an opportunity to show a character and the kind of, the hallucination, the flashback, the sort of the psychological, the mental space simultaneously. So it allows me to do stuff that, frankly, just doesn't look good in a cinematic space. Dividing the screen in a cinema doesn't really look good. It looks like Mike Figgis, in a kind of an art context, you have an opportunity technically to work differently. It's a back projection. It's much more luminous. It's almost jewel-like. You have a much more voyeuristic sense because you're looking at the source of light rather than a reflected light. This might sound esoteric, but it makes a big difference to me.
I would like to do a step back to what you said about television. And I mean, of course, television is present in some of your earlier works. I've read about this exhibition. No? You curated, I think, your only experience, Fido Television, which was in university, and then CNN concatenated. And I think it's also a matter of generation. I think we have the same age. And I read that you say that for the people in our age, television was something that was shaping the way we look at the world, and we learn about news. And then in this film, there is a moment when the young Daniel is watching at his computer. I mean, on one screen he has a Skype with his father, and on the other screen he has some Vimeo or YouTube showing there is some kind of Arab music in the background, maybe. The same thing that you are interested in about television and how much it informs and shapes your way of working on your own film. Would you be interested or able, or is really generationally not possible to do it also with the World Wide Web and with a completely different way that now people younger than us has to look at the world around them?
Well, I would hope so, but I don't think it's. Unfortunately, well, I don't have a TV at home for many years now, and I'm not on social media. I don't have a Facebook page, or I don't tweet, and so I think that's probably for somebody who's 10, 15, 20 years younger, this kind of notion. My notion of television, which is very seminal for me, has to do with a very classic sort of 70s, 80s era television, which was much more iconic and singular. And in the country where I grew up, at least as a child, the TV was literally the kind of the center point. There was one channel, and for the most part, as a child, in black and white, and that's where you went to figure out what things were. And at some point for me, it was a kind of a rupture. I saw a lot of American content on TV, and then we moved to the States when I was 13, and all of a sudden, everything that I saw on the screen in black and white became three-dimensional and colorful and American. And so that encounter between a sort of a safe mediating space and a space that is exhilarating, disorienting, delirious in a way, that kind of transition has always been something that I think is kind of been a trigger, a sort of a ground zero for me, from moving from a very consuming space into a kind of productive space and trying to make sense of that transition. But I think now in 2016, that seems highly nostalgic and highly improbable. I mean, my kids are constantly surrounded by screens, and when I play music from Spotify, they get really angry because there's no video, there's no movie to accompany the music, and so they for them everything is screens, everything is images.
I mean, for who's familiar with your work might know a previous piece called Nostalgia, and I think it's also organized in 3 parts. And also now I was realizing that there are also 3 impersonator of Daniel coming back. And the last chapter of Nostalgia is possibly the one where you step into a more kind of dramatization of the subject, of the material you're working with. No? And so not by chance it comes before, then there is everything that rises must converge in between. But it seems that, I mean, Nostalgia in itself, going from the interview at the very beginning, this reenacted interview in between, and then the fully kind of recreated narrative and dramatized narrative at the end seems to kind of summarize also the process of more enlarge of your work. But you also said that, you were in art school, I've read that you were used to have a kind of prohibition about narration. I mean, that everything has to be kind of minimal, conceptual, and you were were educated by rejecting the idea of narration. And that I read that you said, I resist catharsis in film. But then somehow with this process, and also with the next, we're going to talk also about Remainder, I hope, you had to be forced, or you force yourself, I don't know, to kind of move into that ground that you were probably less confident or familiar with in the first place. Can you just tell me something about this and how it happened? Also how it grow your experience, you change over the years, and now you feel from being worried about that, now moving into that realm.
I think I've always been interested in narrative, and again, I sort of talked about childhood and earlier life, and I understood at a later age the degree to which role playing was important for me, and also the degree to which history and myth was highly essential, highly critical in shaping a personal identity and a collective identity, and actually in both places where I grew up in. And so this has always been a kind of a sort of a latent interest. And of course, I had Robert Morris as a teacher at my MFA program, and so I couldn't make a narrative for him. But I think it was one of the reasons I stopped painting was I became extremely frustrated with the two-dimensional space, and I started doing figurative stuff, and then I started literally writing stories like Sean Lander's on the painting, and then eventually I stopped with figures, and I thought, well, fuck it, I could just move into a different space, and at that point I got the camera. So I think narrative was always highly interesting. It's just the whole point about catharsis is, of course, a kind of a Brechtian game with this notion of how much do we invest in a narrative and how much do we reveal the sort of the agency behind it, if you will. And I see the pieces that I make as sort of existing in between that, and that's why sometimes they're sort of weird and gimpy and half-baked, and they're sort of, stumbling in between those two modes. But that's really where I'm sort of trapped, I think.
And one element is acting, because when in pieces like the casting, you were you resolved to using like this freeze frames, not freeze frame, freeze actors, and this kind of tableau vivant. And I read you said that was really to avoid even the problem of acting. I mean, to avoid the falling into the trap of acting and the trap of emotion, of realism in a way. I mean, or drama. But then now you are doing that, you're working more and more with actors. You come from having your first feature films that is even more like using a different language than continuity, which is remainder. And the other, I would like to know how you feel now different from working with actor from this first experience, like in.
Well, I didn't go to film school, and so very often what I did in my work is also learn things about how to. How to work with actors and how to work with a camera, and I'm still sort of using my work to learn it. With the casting specifically, the story that the young American soldier was telling me was a tragic story that involved him killing a boy, a civilian, by shooting him inside his car. And he sort of used the interview, just like I used the interview. He used it in order to kind of tell his story and to confess it, and I used his story in order to have a critical sort of mass in the story, a point of heat at which the narratives around which the narrative sort of revolves. And I knew that the moment that we would sort of try to get actors, regardless of how good they were, in order to play those roles, this would, at best it would be a kind of a respectable sort of middle-brow naturalism, and at worst it would crumble into a kind of a melodrama. And so what the casting was about, getting these sort of tableaux vivants, these kinds of frozen moments, is to...
Which you're using also here, by the way, now in the scene.
Yeah, I always come back to that. It's a way of freezing the desire to empathize, the desire of the actor to literally embody a role, and to actually pull back a little bit and to say, what is the situation here? What is the setting? What is the image that we're composing? And what is our relationship to it? And the work, again, it sort of moves back and forth between a desire to empathize and then a desire to pull away.
And do you see acting and actors as a possible tool in your hands to add one more layer to the story, to your way of building up this situation and these stories? Can be like, I'm thinking about the protagonist of Remainder. He's a skilled, very good actor. And could it be that, this actor and acting becomes an extra element for you to kind of add one more layer of, analyzing things again, or like doubling things again between the role, the actor, and his experience, something you're interested in, or you saw as a possible kind of further development of your strategy?
Yes.
Okay. And you feel you are is already, I mean, in place, or something that is, I mean, it's continuity is already something that you are working on this direction, or it happened more with, I mean, I saw Remainder, so unfortunately, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but also the acting style is very different. You're working with German actors here, with British actors there, so you're also kind of experiencing something new in that realm.
Yeah, no, I think that, excuse me, the production country makes a big difference. Remainder is a completely different project, and there were a lot of people involved in making Remainder, and there were very few people involved in making continuity. And I think the sort of, the two projects are just reflect different points of interest that I have with narrative, in time. I mean, Remainder could have been a different film. It maybe should have been a different film. It could have been a 10-hour long film in which we get a chance to really explore temporal space, to be with a protagonist in time. But there is this kind of imperative to narrate, which kind of haunts the movie, and I think in some respects is good. It's just a completely different project than Remainder, although both protagonists are dealing, in a sense, with a rupture, with trauma, with this notion that their own linear space and time has been disrupted, and it forces them to create a self-made sort of artificial world, which is highly theatrical, which is highly referencing art and film, and to use that as a tool to deal with that, to sort of to fill in the hole, the rupture that's been created, and they're just used different languages. These two projects.
You have shot them more or less because they've been released very close one to the other. I mean, Remainder last October and Continuity a few months later. Did you shot them or work on them at the same time? And in this way, have they possibly influenced one the other? I mean, you were going to different direction and you wanted to explore different direction at the same time. How did it work? Or they were, I mean, very much separated in your practice?
While making Remainder, I shot a bunch of projects. I shot a project in 2011 called 5,000 Feet is the Best, which is a documentary.
Remainder took that long to...
Yeah,
okay.
It took 5 years to make, and so I made 5,000 Feet. I made this project Continuity. I made my little attempt at pornography with Everything That Rises Must Converge in 2013, and then I shot this right after we finished editing Remainder. And so, the engagement in film and cinema is much more open-ended. It's much longer, and art is it's kind of like a one-night stand in a way compared to Remainder, which is a kind of a 5-year-long relationship.
And Remainder is also the first project, if I'm not wrong, that, I mean, the subject is, I mean, the starting point is not just your own research or your own idea, but you work on a previous material, no? And you work with someone else, with McCarthy on his novel. Is it something that it was the first time you did something like that, am I right? Or?
Yeah.
And how did it came along, and how did it felt, most of all, since you were otherwise used to be totally like in control of the project from the very first idea to the final?
I'm really hardly ever in control of the project.
Looks like
in the best scenario, the project takes control of me, and Remainder is very much it was a long process. As I said, it took 5 years to make, and so adapting a novel into a 97-minute feature film is it's something that I probably would not have done had I known how it was going to feel while doing it. But now that it's finished, I'm happy. So it's just they're different economies. The cinema and the art economies are very different, and the way that they produce, in this case, narratives and films is entirely different. And I'm very familiar with this system, with this economy, and I sort of, in my way, sort of thrive in it. And I think cinema is just a different beast altogether.
And the experience of these two films, I mean, they didn't happen at the same time, but now they somehow exist at the same time. Did it change your expectation towards your project in coming up? I mean, is something Remainder now something that you want to pursue in terms of production ways, or working with someone else, working on other materials, or it's more like continuity shows more the direction you want to move with the next?
I think cinema is extremely seductive to somebody who is working with, who's trying to realize ideas into little worlds. And if you have a kind of a cinema budget, then you can create a world that's a little bit bigger, that you can step into for a little bit longer and get lost in for a while. And that is the most seductive thing about it. For the art projects, it's a much shorter span. So it's a little bit like the difference, perhaps, between writing, or producing or consuming short stories and novels, in a sense. I don't necessarily privilege one over the other. I really like to have. I really think the experience of both is critical. But if it happens again, it'll be seductive.
Please.
You can yell. Well, let's.
I can yell. Thank you. I want to go back a little bit to talking about. Well, first of all, you're talking about the economies of cinema and art are very different. And a film, generally when it makes a feature-length film, that is sort of like the end. That's the end product. And you talk about, especially with this, continuity, how it took many different forms. And this is the most recent form. But the most recent form is, in fact, a feature-length film. One could look at it as that. So do you see that as being the end of that, like you won't work on it anymore? Or might you still make yet some other version of this?
No, the very last version of continuity is a work called Spring, which is 45 minutes long and is that kind of 5-screen projection that I talked about. And if you watch it, if you actually want to sit down and compare, I think the experience of seeing the two works is entirely different. Not only because there's extra scenes in Spring that you don't see here, and it really explores that sort of young teenager. The blonde teenager's world a little bit more. You actually step into the computer that he's watching, and you get a little bit more into the world of ISIS, and you have their national anthem and all sorts of stuff, and you have a sense that his notion of role playing is beginning to coalesce before he gets consumed by the parents and killed. But I mean that version was made after the piece was produced for the Berlinale. This version, so it's ongoing.
One last. So just to wrap this up, I mean, it's 1 week from the release of Remainder in the UK. It has been released in Germany already. Continuity will also likely be released, you told me, soon, maybe next autumn. What is your experience with this? With the piece, with the film going out there? I mean, coming from an experience of being very much in control of the condition of presentation, of your installations, of your previous works, and now think that, you're not in control anymore. I mean, the film is working and living out there in a completely different way of circulation. How do you feel about that?
I think drinking helps. I think alcohol is wonderful. Some other drugs as well. I don't. The moment that the work is over, it's it goes out there, and I don't have a lot of opportunity to actually, I didn't watch the screening. I was outside reading Miranda July's novel, and I don't actually like this this notion. I need it. I need the work to be seen by public, but I don't like to be there. It's like watching your parents, right? So. Yeah, it's a kind of I suppose a paradox, but yeah.
Okay, if there isn't any other question from the audience, I thank you very much for being with us this evening. I thank again Art Basel for the opportunity of this screening organized and curated by the Film Festival in Locarno. I just remind you that the festival will take place next August, as usual. I mean, if most of you are Swiss, you should know when it happens, so we wait for you there. And in the end, thanks most of all to Omer for the film and for being here this evening. Okay, thank you.